More than 90% of beginners make a mistake when choosing the main channel to deploy for automating their outbound prospecting. One of the most common questions people often ask me is, Antoine, should I be prioritizing LinkedIn messaging or focusing on cold emails? Indeed, these are two exceptionally effective channels when you want to secure meetings with qualified prospects without having to pick up the phone or implement costly, long-term marketing strategies. So in this video, I'm going to show you the advantages and disadvantages of these two channels and how to either use them separately or, on the contrary, combine them in a multi-channel strategy. I'm Antoine Toro, co-founder of the Sendo agency and the B2B Ninja training programs. And regularly, I publish videos on topics like B2B lead generation, cold outreach, the role of AI in all of this, and go-to-market engineering. So, before diving into the details of these two channels, a quick reminder of what cold outreach is. It's a way to directly approach prospects who are in our target audience, to try to engage with them, and in particular, to get a meeting. We start by identifying our targets by doing targeting on LinkedIn or other platforms or using other data sources on the web. Next, we scrape this data such as first name, last name, company name, and possibly other very useful information. From this data, we will enrich it, either to find an email address or to obtain more precise information about the contacts. And finally, we will automate this outreach process. This is exactly where you need to choose which channel to use. Should we use LinkedIn messaging, which is integrated into the platform, or should we create dedicated email addresses for cold emailing so we can send emails directly to our prospects' inboxes? The beginning of the process is obviously the same, but then there are a few nuances depending on which channel you choose. If I start with LinkedIn, the LinkedIn messaging system, so the advantages are that you can very quickly deploy cold outreach on LinkedIn. There is a certain simplicity and, well, almost no technical setup required. Another advantage is that you're immediately on a professional social network platform with a profile photo, a profile page, and that instantly provides a certain level of reassurance. The disadvantages of LinkedIn are related to volume. In fact, we're very limited, especially nowadays, by the number of invitations or messages we can send through the platform. An account will have fairly low limits. Then there's the risk of being blocked, but, well, as long as you play by the rules and know the limits not to cross, the risk is minimal. And finally, there's an issue which isn't really a problem once you've launched this channel, but rather something you might consider beforehand, which is that a LinkedIn profile, unlike an email address that you can create from scratch ex nihilo, is personal. So sometimes certain people, colleagues or employees may be reluctant to use their own personal profile for automation or prospecting in the way we would like to do it. And finally, when it comes to results on LinkedIn, well, I can't really say there's an advantage or disadvantage compared to cold emails because it depends on the target audience. For many targets, especially in B2B, and for fairly corporate targets within companies, there will be an advantage because the ratio of positive responses will be a bit higher, particularly thanks to what I mentioned earlier about that aspect of reassurance, that sense of connection. You can immediately see who you're talking to, and with just one click, check who this person is, who they work for, and so on. So that's going to be quite true for traditional corporate targets or mid-sized companies. On the other hand, the results can be disastrous or very mixed as soon as you have a target audience that is either hardly on LinkedIn at all or is not very active there. And despite the fact that these people have profiles and accounts on LinkedIn, we don't realize that in reality they don't really use the platform and so they simply won't see our messages. To give you an example, doctors are very difficult to reach on LinkedIn simply because many doctors don't have a profile, but even those who do usually only filled it out at some point because someone told them to. Like their cousin said, hey, why don't you have a profile? It's good, even for you as a doctor. They created one, but in reality, they quickly lost interest in the platform and they never come back to it. They never log in. So even if we find their profile on LinkedIn and contact them directly through the platform, there's a good chance that, in fact, they never see our attempt to reach out. Now, what are the advantages and disadvantages of cold emails? Well, the big advantage is scalability. It means we're not at all limited in terms of volume. With cold emails, we can simply buy new email accounts, purchase new domains, and potentially scale this infinitely. So there's no limit in terms of scalability when it comes to cold emails. The second aspect, which is also related to this volume, is actually what I would call the speed at which you can get feedback and analyze things. Since we have a lot of volume, we can run tests much more quickly, whether it's A/B tests, tests on different segments, different hooks, different copywriting, but also different targeting, which isn't always possible. If you only have 1, 2, or even 3 LinkedIn profiles at your disposal, you won't be able to send out as much volume or learn as quickly. It's not necessarily a problem if you already know very precisely what works for your prospecting. But if you still need to go through that learning phase, cold email will give you that speed of execution. Now, what are the drawbacks of cold email? The thing is, you still need 2 to 3 weeks of warm-up to be able to use new addresses safely, and there's a risk of ending up in spam. There are all the deliverability issues because obviously if we don't deliver, if we don't land in the main inbox, we're not read or barely read, and all our efforts are in vain. And thirdly, there are more technical configurations, which can be intimidating. In reality, it's not that complicated, but still, for cold emailing compared to LinkedIn, there is a bit of technical setup required in order to ensure good deliverability and the positive results that come with it. So, based on this information about the advantages and disadvantages of the LinkedIn channel and the cold email channel, I'm offering you this infographic, which is simply a decision tree that will easily guide you toward the channel I recommend you use first. So the first question we're going to ask is your persona on LinkedIn? If you're targeting CIOs of large companies, they're all on LinkedIn. They all have a profile. Because it's a matter of showcasing oneself in the professional world and for one's career. If you're an executive at a large company, you absolutely need a LinkedIn profile. So there's no question, there's nothing to think about. They are on LinkedIn, and it's very likely that they're quite active on LinkedIn as well. Conversely, as I mentioned earlier, doctors, surgeons, and dermatologists have almost no professional interest in being on this platform, so they won't have an account or will be very inactive. So if your target audience isn't really on LinkedIn, then we're in the no category and we'll lean more towards using emails, which makes sense. Second question, this one is more to guide you in broad strokes, kind of a rule of thumb, how many people are in your company. If you're a freelancer, what I recommend is to start with LinkedIn because as a freelancer, prospecting might not be your main job. You just need to find assignments for yourself and spend as little time on it as possible. So I advise you to go for a simpler setup and use LinkedIn. It's exactly the same logic for a company with between 1 and 5 employees or collaborators. Generally speaking, there can be exceptions. Maybe you have the tools, the desire, and the knowledge to move towards cold emailing, which requires a bit more preparation and technical skill. But overall, generally speaking, when you have a very small team, it's the same as for a freelancer. Lead generation and prospecting are not your main job. You should focus on your core business. So in this case, I would also recommend going for something simpler to set up like LinkedIn. Now, starting from 5 employees, we move to the other branch of the infographic, and the question is, do you need to scale? What do I mean by scale? I mean, do you really need to go significantly beyond the total bandwidth provided by all of the various LinkedIn accounts that you are currently using to automate your company's outbound prospecting efforts? We'll see this in just a moment. I have a tool called Labac that lets you determine how many emails or LinkedIn accounts you need to reach your goals. So we'll get into those details right after, but the idea is to first figure out how many LinkedIn accounts you can actually use. Do I just have my own LinkedIn account, or how many colleagues would agree to let me use their LinkedIn accounts for this kind of automation and prospecting? Knowing that generally this is an internal discussion since a profile is still something personal, so the tools won't actually access the person's profile. We won't be sharing passwords or giving full access. In fact, we'll just grant permissions that via API allow certain actions to be automated. And so you often need to do a bit of explaining and educate your colleagues about this. But even in this scenario, you won't necessarily be able to use the LinkedIn accounts of all your company's employees, which makes sense. It's more likely to be accounts belonging to founders or salespeople. And in that case, you need to quickly assess how many contacts you'll be able to reach each month. So we'll look at that in the next part. That's what I mean when I ask you, do you need to scale? Beyond the bandwidth provided by all the LinkedIn accounts you'll be able to use. So if the LinkedIn accounts you can use don't allow you to reach as many contacts as you should each month, then you need to switch to emails. Because as I mentioned earlier, there's no problem scaling infinitely with cold email. If you don't need to scale, then you stick with LinkedIn. And finally, if you need a much higher volume, then one last question is whether you need to improve your conversion rates. Now, once again, I need to give a bit of context to explain what this question means, because we always need to improve conversion rates. Obviously, we always want to do better. It's a never-ending pursuit, we can all agree on that. What I'm getting at is simply that most of the time, when you launch cold email campaigns on their own, you'll get good results and they'll be satisfactory. At the very least, you'll be at the market average and the results will be good enough to keep using this channel and of course to try to do better and always improve through a process of continuous improvement. But if you realize that, in fact, and this is where you need to have at least some knowledge of the subject, That you're doing everything right, all the components of cold emailing in terms of targeting, data preparation, automation, technical setup, deliverability, and copywriting. You actually know perfectly well that you've followed all the best practices, and you might even have benchmarks knowing that for another company or a similar target, it works. You realize that for a certain target, for example, the results are really poor. Well, that's when you get to the answer. Yes, to my question, do you need to improve your conversion rates? Because sometimes you end up targeting audiences that are particularly tough. I'll give you some examples, but generally, the bigger the company you go after, the harder it is to reach people who are high up in the hierarchy. So if you're targeting a CEO from the SASE 40, there's very little chance you'll manage to talk to them with a cold email. Do you agree? Whereas a CEO of a startup, that's fine. And so not necessarily talking about the CEO, but about people who are high up, maybe members of the executive committee, or in any case, holding very senior positions in very large companies, well, potentially it's going to be harder. Then there are also simply different types of jobs. There are certain jobs like CISOs, heads of IT cybersecurity, or engineers, so often more technical profiles, that are generally quite resistant to marketing. And that's no exception when it comes to cold outreach. So these profiles are going to be a bit harder to reach. The flip side is that these profiles precisely are approached by fewer salespeople. So once we manage to quote unquote get a hold of them, these leads are more valuable, but they're hard to get into a meeting. And that's where multi-channel outreach comes in, varying the ways and points of contact, using at least these two channels and potentially others to maximize our chances of simply getting in touch with them in a positive way. I'll give you one last strategic tip. Don't necessarily start with multi-channel right away. Now, yes, this might surprise you because you've probably heard advice saying that multi-channel is great, that it helps boost your ratios, your metrics, and so on. And that's absolutely true. Indeed, it's a very good way to improve your metrics, to actually combine these different touch points into a single campaign to reach a specific target audience. The problem is that when you start cold outreach, a common beginner's mistake is wanting to mix a lot of things together in every possible way, and even add SMS, WhatsApp, and so on. Because today, many platforms like Lemlist make it possible to do that. So we're tempted, we get a bit caught up in the features, and I end up seeing clients I take on who have campaigns that are a mess with almost every possible and imaginable touch point. And in fact, it makes it harder to analyze what works and what doesn't. So at the beginning, I strongly encourage you to stick to a simple approach. Really, at the very beginning, if you're just starting out or if you're targeting a new segment, a new type of ICP, what I recommend is to actually run an A/B test, a real A/B test between cold email and LinkedIn. As you know, to run a proper A/B test, it's like a scientific experiment. Everything else needs to be equal. And so that means you need to have exactly the same contact list. In fact, you start with the same batch and randomly split it into two. You also need to have the same timing. So when I talk about the same timing, obviously you won't be able to send to all the contacts at exactly the same moment or with exactly the same volume, because most of the time there's a difference in volume capacity between the email channel and the LinkedIn channel. But to eliminate any seasonality effects, I recommend launching the campaigns in parallel. And finally, in terms of copywriting, you also need to have the same copywriting with adjustments made for each channel. For LinkedIn messaging, since it's a chat, you'll want to be even more concise and engage even more in a conversational style. But overall, in your copywriting, aside from these adjustments, you need to have the same hook, talk about the same issues, and if you mention client references, give the same ones, etc. And from there, run your test and observe both the differences in results that you notice, as well as the differences in engagement systems that work with one channel or the other. And once you have this learning, well then, yes, you can start mixing and doing multi-channel approaches and thus vary the touchpoints with different strategies. I won't go into detail, but basically you can create sequences that mix these different channels in all sorts of ways. It's up to you to test what works. Do you add a few LinkedIn touchpoints in the middle of a sequence with several emails? Or on the contrary, do you send an email after several unsuccessful attempts on LinkedIn? There are plenty of possible approaches, but I'll let you test them out in a multi-channel strategy once you've done this A/B test in isolation. And finally, as promised, I'm going to introduce you to a homemade tool called ABAC, which will allow you to simulate, based on your objectives, the volume you need to reach in terms of contacts and, as a result, in terms of licenses, either in terms of the number of email inboxes you'll need to use or the number of LinkedIn accounts you'll need to automate. And this little calculation will also help you decide whether to go with one channel or the other, or even to combine both. So, like all B2B Ninja tools, on the first tab, you'll find the instructions, just go over them, and basically after that, it's very simple. You start from your objectives, for example, your number of sales. The goal is to sign 8 new clients per month. The average basket isn't actually useful in the calculation. It's just there to give you an idea of the business volume you can generate. So let's say we have 8,000 euros in LTV or lifetime value per client. Next, what's going to be crucial are all the assumptions we enter here. The conversion rate is the rate between the stage where I have a discovery meeting and when I sign the client, when I make the sale. So this is a sales conversion rate linked to the effectiveness of your sales teams. I put 15% because that's a fairly typical rate, not very high either, but rather standard for B2B conversion. Then you have the positive response rate, so for cold emails. Here it depends a lot on various factors, but mainly on your effectiveness, the relevance of your copywriting, and your targeting. So let's go with 3%. This isn't a ratio based on the number of emails sent, okay? It's a ratio based on the number, so how many positive responses we get out of the number of unique contacts we reached out to. So, given the definition I just gave you, 3% is already a good rate. Next, here we have the average email enrichment rate found by the tools you use. This isn't super important because now, anyway, we pay per credit for each email found with this kind of tool. And you have the maximum number of emails sent by us, which we call senders at Sendo. We'll rather call them inboxes, the email addresses, the email boxes that you will use specifically for cold emailing. So I put 25. Generally, today, at the time I'm making this video, we're more likely to try to get closer to 30. You can definitely do more, but to ensure good deliverability to a main inbox and not end up in promotion tabs or elsewhere, one of the many best practices is to keep a volume that a human could realistically handle. So 25 or 30 per day allows you to land properly in the main inbox. And today, that's really what I recommend to you. Stay within that limit. And if you need more volume, well, just use more email accounts, more senders. The average number of emails per contact, well, it could be that. It could be 3.2, You can use decimals. It's actually going to be the average in your sequences. How many emails do you send to a contact on average? And finally, over how many days of the week do you send emails? In general, in B2B, we stick to office hours from Monday to Friday. So we're talking about 5 days. I'll add another assumption. Next, in the results on the BAC, what interests us is mainly the last 2 lines. That is, here, to reach your goals with the ratios you've provided, the tool tells you how many enrichment credits you need. In reality, you need to find about 1,800 emails. And so most tools today, as I mentioned, charge you per email found. So you need a plan for 1,800. So maybe a plan for 2,000 per month would actually be well suited. As for the number of senders, the number of email accounts to plan for, what does that come out to? That comes out to 10. Now that's a rounded number. If you're interested, you can display the details, It's a formula, but it's rounded up to the nearest whole number. These calculations tell you that you need to plan for 10 email accounts. So there you go. 10 email accounts isn't that much. It's not that expensive either. Once you start getting results, there's absolutely no problem buying 10 email accounts to implement your strategy. Let's take a look at what happens if we change some assumptions. If we say we're sending an average of 30 per day, obviously I need a bit fewer email addresses. I only need 8. Let's suppose our salespeople are better and convert at 18% instead of 15%. Well, there you go. I need a bit less. So then, if you do not know a certain number of assumptions, I recommend you download the tool. There is a link in the description and just keep the default assumptions that are already filled in because they are more or less averages for B2B. They are pretty standard figures. After that, you will have the same logic for the LinkedIn channel, It's basically the same thing with a few minor differences because actually when it comes to the ratios, there are 2 ratios regarding the effectiveness of your outreach. First, there is the acceptance rate of connection requests on LinkedIn. I set it at 30%. 30%, again, between 20 and 30% is pretty standard. You really need to try to maximize this ratio. And then, among those who accepted the connection request and with whom you are now connected, that's the ratio of people who will book a meeting, who will accept the discovery meeting. So basically, you combine these 2 ratios to get the number of meetings compared to the total number of contacts you reach out to at the top of your process. I didn't go into detail about this earlier, same thing on the cold email tab, but here we actually have some information that, well, as indicated, is just for your information. It doesn't give you the final result, but it gives you benchmarks, helps you understand basically, okay, how many meetings do you actually need to have in order to sign your clients? How many contacts do you need to reach out to? So how many do you need to scrape? because you have a 75% email discoverability rate, and so on and so forth. These are intermediate results that are actually quite interesting. And here it's the same thing. What we're interested in at the end is asking ourselves, how many LinkedIn accounts do I need? So based on my assumptions, I need 3 LinkedIn accounts. Can you have 3 LinkedIn accounts in your company? Well, plus 2 others. 3, in general, it's not unreasonable to go for 3 LinkedIn accounts. You need to get 3 licenses that allow you to automate a LinkedIn account. But why not? If you have assumptions because you know that in fact the assumptions you've already observed or that you're projecting aren't exactly these ones, if you also have so-called weak LinkedIn accounts, which are very inactive and on which you don't have a paid license, well, the 20 per day might not be achievable, at least on average, because it's really just an average. If that's lower, etc., and you actually see that you're starting to have a number of LinkedIn accounts that you won't be able to manage with automation, well, that gives you a clue to say, okay, maybe I have 2 LinkedIn accounts, I'm going to use them, but here I would need 6. Well, then I'm forced, in order to scale and reach the goals we have, to turn partly to cold emailing. So that's the logic behind this tool. It's free, you can download the link and make projections with it. As you understand, you need to choose your main acquisition channel for cold outreach based on your target and your company's context. I recommend that you start by testing both channels separately to measure the metrics. And later on, why not try multi-channel by combining the two? If you choose cold emailing as one of your strategies, be very careful about deliverability. I've made a full video on this topic, so you can go check it out. Well, to wrap up, to size your entire stack, as we've seen, there's the LabBack tool with formulas that allow you to size everything and make projections. So you can download it for free, don't hesitate. There you go. If you enjoyed this video and if it brought you some clarity, go ahead and give me a like. Obviously, it makes me happy and it supports me to keep sharing this kind of expertise and knowledge. And maybe we'll see each other in a future video. See you next time.